Hello, ladies and gentlemen, Koldar here. Today we are looking at a guide to Lei Shen, the final boss for normal Throne of Thunder. This encounter is quite a lot of fun, and it seems appropriate difficulty. It is the most challenging fight that we faced on normal, so that seems to work out well. And so this is really split up into a lot of different phases. And some of the phases share different mechanics and abilities. Others are unique to the phase. So I think the easiest thing to do is to just explain the overall mechanics, and then we'll go through each phase. So let's get started. So raid composition is pretty standard fare. You will need 2 tanks and 2 or 3 healers. We are going with 2 healers in this video, and it seems just fine. There are a few situations where your healers will be limited by their global cooldowns and not by their mana. Essentially, you won't really spend much mana on this fight. At least that's what we found. So for that reason, 2 healers is pretty much plenty. And everything else is just as normal. So the primary mechanic or gimmick for this encounter is that of conduits. So at the 4 cardinal corners of the room, northeast, southwest, exists 1 conduit. And each conduit has its own energy bar, which is known as the electric charge on it. Anytime Lei Shen is within about 15 yards of a conduit, it will charge up, basically draining power from Lei Shen and increasing the energy of the conduit. If a conduit reaches full energy, it gains a stacking buff, which is referred to as a level. It levels up. So when this happens, the conduit becomes more powerful. Now each conduit has a unique ability that it will add to Lei Shen's arsenal when Lei Shen is within charge range of it, when he's connected to the conduit. So there are 4 different conduits and 4 unique abilities, and never the twain shall meet. Now, if Lei Shen is ever not within charge range of a conduit during one of the normal phases, he will gain the ability to AE the entire raid via the discharge energy ability. This does damage every half second, and the damage starts at around 10,000, and then it goes up basically every tick by about 1,000 or so. So this damage will quickly ramp up and overwhelm your raid, and therefore it forces you to keep Lei Shen near a conduit for most of the encounter. You can move him away from them for a brief period, but you do not want to keep him far from a conduit during most of the normal phase. So the next logical step is to go over the abilities that the conduits will infuse into Lei Shen. So you can see here at the start of the fight, we start at the south conduit, and this ability is overcharged. So you can see it's cast right there on the priest just behind me. This player becomes very large, and after about 4 seconds, they will explode in a ring of electricity. Anyone that is within about a 5-yard radius of that player remains in a safe zone and is not harmed in any way, including the player that it was cast on. However, outside of that 5-yard safe zone, the electrical ring expands up to about 40-yard radius, and anyone that's hit by the electrical ring before it disperses takes moderate damage and is stunned for 3 seconds. This stun is a magic effect, and it can be dispelled. Next we have the east conduit, and this is the diffusion chain, or chain lightning basically. So when this is cast by Lei Shen, it's on a random raid member, and any player within 5 yards of that target will chain the effect to the new player, and this continues. Each player that is hit, including the initial target, will spawn a small ad on the platform, and these ads have about 1.5 million health. They don't do much damage, but they will become annoying. So basically, when you're on the east platform, spread out your raid about 10 yards, and you won't get more than 1 ad. Now right there, that was Static Shock from the north platform. This is similar to the overcharge effect in that you can stack on players, but in this case it does about 700,000 nature damage split among all players within 10 yards of the target. But if you're outside it, there's no negative effect. So as long as you have enough players stacked up to soak it, you're fine. Then the final conduit ability to the west is the bouncing balls there. You saw them just drop down. Usually this is in the form of 3 little blue circles on a random location around the ground. And if these hit the ground without a player standing underneath them when they land, it will spawn an unharnessed power ad. These are much stronger ads than the ones from the diffusion chain lightning effect. They have a lot more health. They're very dangerous, so be careful. So here if you see, we're in a different phase, but that's the same basic ball effect. So at least one player has to soak up the bouncing balls when they land. And if they're not soaked up by a player, someone does not stand in one, it will spawn an ad and then it will bounce again. And this process can repeat over and over. So if you don't handle the bouncing bolt locations, you'll quickly find that you have a ton of ads active and you'll just be overwhelmed. So with the basics of the conduit abilities out of the way, let's rewind and then we'll talk through Lei Shen's abilities as well and how they interact in the primary phase. So during phase 1, when you initially engage Lei Shen, all the way until he reaches 65% health, he has a few basic abilities. The first is Decapitate, which is your tank swap ability. When this is cast on the current tank, it applies a 5-second debuff. After that debuff expires, that tank will take a maximum of 3 million physical damage. However, this damage is reduced the further the target is away from Lei Shen at the time it expires. So if your tank properly runs away when they get Decapitate, the damage on them will be fairly minor, around 200,000 or so. In addition, it also applies a 30-second debuff that increases physical damage by 50%, or excuse me, 100% actually. So the basics setup is pretty simple. When one tank gets Decapitate, the other tank immediately taunts while the Decapitate target runs away. And this repeats over and over. You'll also find, we'll get to the timing later, but our tanks generally would taunt to move the boss between various corners of the room. And this timing worked out pretty well with Decapitate as well. His next ability is Thunderstruck, which you can see on the right of the room there. This is cast toward a random raid member. It does not pick based on class or role, like many abilities do. Instead, it chooses based on distance from the boss. So melee is a valid target if they're not quite in melee range when it is cast. And this is true for many of the abilities in this fight. But essentially it tries to pick someone at range, and it will throw his axe at that location after a few seconds. The damage that it deals, similar to the tank Decapitate ability, is lowered the further from the Thunderstruck zone you are standing. So here's another Thunderstruck in the bottom right, and you can see everyone is at least 30 or 40 yards away, and the damage is very minor, 150,000 or so. But if you're close, it's going to kill you. So just watch for that timer and move away appropriately. And then finally we have Crashing Thunder. And this is cast fairly frequently on 3 random locations within melee range of the boss, basically on melee targets. So you can kind of see the bolts shooting up into the ceiling. And they're very, very visually active. So you can clearly see when they're going off. But essentially they just do heavy nature damage every second to anyone standing in them. So it's a way to slightly force your melee to reposition and your tanks to move the boss a little bit. But that's about it. They're not very dangerous. Now the next thing to mention is that you can deactivate a conduit once per normal phase in this fight. So as you progress through the fight, you can choose which conduit ability you want to eliminate from future phases of the encounter. And you can do this by forcing a conduit to have the most current energy of all the conduits when you enter the next intermission phase. So generally this is whichever conduit you decide is the most dangerous to the raid, the most problematic for you. You'll want that one to be the highest energy during the first phase before you push to 65%. And then that conduit will be destroyed when you enter the second phase. So let's quickly go through how the phases line up with each other based on the conduit deactivation mode. So the phase and conduit deactivation works as follows. Phase 1 is from 100% to 65%, and all 4 conduits are active. During intermission number 1, all conduit abilities are used on the raid, and we'll talk about how intermissions work in just a moment. Then during phase 2, 65% to 30%, only 3 conduits are active. This means that the highest energy conduit at the end of phase 1 was the one chosen for deactivation. And therefore, during phase 2 and intermission number 2, you only are dealing with the abilities from 3 conduits rather than all 4. And then finally, phase 3, no conduits are active in essence because you only fight the boss at that point. So at 65%, the first intermission phase begins. And this is where Lei Shen will port to the center of the room. He becomes immune to damage. And for 45 seconds, the entire raid must handle all of the abilities from the active conduits at the time, which of course means all 4 conduits since you haven't killed any yet. This is by far the most challenging phase in the entire encounter, and you'll have to do it twice. So really most of your time will be spent practicing this intermission stuff. When you get this worked out and down well, the rest will fall into place pretty quickly. Now, because you have all 4 conduit abilities, most of these do not force you to be in a particular position. So static shock, you just stack up on the player. They can move while they have it on them. Overcharge, the player can't move, but other players can just ignore them and run away or stand in the safe zone in the middle. And the diffusion chain that spawns ads when it hits a player, again, does not force you to be in any particular place. So the only ability that actually forces you to be in position is Bouncing Bolt. And this is the one that will be the most annoying because of it. So Bouncing Bolt can land on any place on the platform during this phase. Because of that, you have to have positions spread out around the room. Therefore, in the top left, you can see the basic setup that we have for this first intermission phase. And the actual directions, the corners that we use are not important. What's important is the distribution relative to others. So in one position in the north, we have both of our tanks, and this is because they can survive with only 2 of them very easily. They're not valid targets for a lot of the abilities. Next to them on the east, we then have 1 healer and 2 DPS. So that's where I'm standing in this section. And then south, we have both melee DPS. This is no particular reason that they're melee, it just is a good split for us. And then finally, opposite my position is the other healer and then 2 more DPS. So by positioning this way, healers have maximum coverage on the raid. I can move left slightly to help heal the melee DPS, and our other healer can move right slightly to do the same while covering our own groups. And then tanks really very rarely need any heals, if at all. All right, so because intermission is by far the most difficult aspect, I thought I'd offer some tips that I and the rest of the raid learned over our practice attempts on this. So let's go down the list here and talk about each one. So first, get into the quadrant positions that you're assigned to early. You need to be ready because these abilities are going to start very quickly after the phase begins. And if you're across the opposite side of the room and you can't get over in time to pick up a bolt, or you get overcharged stuck in the middle, it's bad. Second, spread your quadrant group out whenever possible. This just prevents extra adds from the diffusion chain when that goes off, and also gives you better coverage to get bouncing bolt that happen to be at far sides of your quadrant area. Communicate with nearby quadrants when overcharge explosion will approach them. So this one is pretty vital, and basically it just means that in a situation where, say, the blue quadrant where I am and the green one on our left, if we both are getting overcharge, or like right there, our shaman's getting overcharge, he says something, and now we know that the overcharge blast is probably going to reach into the blue quadrant, and we should move away from that direction as soon as we can. And this will just help everyone out a little bit. They'll get used to communicating about it and know where to stand. Fourth, be very aware of static shock casts, especially healers and people within your own quadrant as well. So, as a healer, I added mine to a major emphasis on my grid, so I can clearly see who has it, and then I can note that if it's on someone in my group, that I need to top everyone off right away. If it's on a melee player, I can step over to the side and try to heal them up a little bit. And vice versa for other healer, you can do the same thing. So if it's on you or one of your quadrant members, even if you're not a healer, you can use a cooldown to help out your healer, especially if you're in a duo pair. So if you're in the duo melee group or whatever it is for your raid, you're going to need a cooldown most likely to survive. It's a lot of damage. Number 5, also related to static shock, allow a single player to soak up the static shock damage if they have a very strong cooldown that allows them to survive it by themselves. So luckily enough, in this particular video, you see I do that twice in one phase. So here's the second time, so I'm able to just use one of my personal cooldowns and not force other group members that are in my quadrant to stack up, because this just creates, preventable damage that needs to be mitigated or healed in some way. So if it's cast on a single player, Shadow Priest, Monk, Paladin, whatever, that can mitigate all the damage, or most of it, that player can just let their quadrant group know that this particular static shock, you don't have to stack up. So again, here's another one where I use diffuse magic. Just tell my group members not to worry about it, and saves me a lot of healing on them. 6, try to keep healers near the front or center of their quadrant. So generally speaking, I'll hang out near the golden circle, kind of in the middle, or slightly off to the left, and this will allow me to step over quickly and heal the melee group that's on my left side. 7th, do not double up when you're soaking bouncing bolts, because it just serves no purpose and deals extra damage. So as long as one person is going to be in the bouncing bolt, this is especially true if you have 3 players but there's only 1 bounce, or 3 players but there's only 2 even. You don't need to have 2 people in the same one. You're just both going to take damage for no purpose. So right there at the bottom there, our druid goes in, and then the hunter and I don't have to worry about it. And then finally, talk with your quadrant members about stacking and spreading as necessary. This is just basic good practice, but this is good for if you get overcharge, just slightly alert your quadrant members. We did it by the color of marker that's in the quadrant. Say, hey, blue stack up, or blue spread, or whatever it is. So that'll help quite a bit. So as the intermission phase ends, you'll notice that the quadrant that had the highest energy at the start of intermission has now become deactivated, and that quadrant of the room is covered in lightning. You don't want to stand in there, obviously. But of course, this means that that ability is not used anymore, as we discussed earlier. Instead, in Phase 2, Lei Shen has a new set of abilities that he'll use. So I'll just cover those briefly. The first is, again, he will discharge energy if he's not near a conduit. So it's just like the first phase. You have to keep him near a conduit at all times, pretty much. He also uses Fusion Slash now as a tank ability. This is not quite the same as Decapitate. Instead, he will deal massive nature damage to that target, about 400,000, in addition to knocking them back about 15 yards or so. So it's really important that your tank that's current on Lei Shen keeps their back to the center of the room, because when Fusion Slash goes off, they don't want to be knocked off the platform. It's obviously unrecoverable death and very embarrassing, and everyone will laugh at them. So just make sure your tanks are aware of that. But just like Decapitate, when Fusion hits a tank, the other tank will taunt. So one of our tanks got thrown back, and the other tank taunts as soon as that hits. And that's pretty much it. And just repeat that process. The most important ability for this second phase from Lei Shen is Ball Lightning. So there you can see Summon Ball Lightning casting right there. When this is cast, it summons 6 little ball lightnings at the locations of random raid members. And when they spawn, they do about 50,000 nature damage to anyone within 5 or 10 yards of the target. But then they also will randomly jump around the room, and if there's anyone within, or actually without, so that means further than, say, 10 or 15 yards, they will just jump back and forth between those targets. So the best way to handle Ball Lightning is once they spawn, have your entire raid stack up, and this will prevent them from jumping around. And then you can also AE them much easier. So there you see they spawned while we were spread out. Now once they've spawned, we stack up and AE them down, and it's much more efficient this way. And then the final ability is Lightning Whip, which is right there. It's probably the most obvious graphic you've ever seen in the game. So if you get hit by it, you're very blind. But it's basically just a cone attack. It does massive damage to you if you get hit by the actual impact. So just sidestep it, and then it leaves behind some electricity on the ground that you don't want to stand in. It does damage to you, but it's not a major amount. You can walk through it. Just don't be in it all the time. And that pretty much covers it. So those are the new abilities for Lei Shen. He doesn't use anything else except for the Conduit abilities, which we talked about before. So you may notice that the amount of health on Lei Shen to go from Phase 1 to Phase 2, and then from Phase 2 to Phase 3 is the same. It's 35% each time. However, in Phase 1, you have time to move between 4 conduits without letting them reach 100 energy, whereas in Phase 2, you can only move between 3 conduits since one of them is deactivated, and you can't use that part of the room. So the Phase 2 DPS requirement is significantly higher than Phase 1. We did not have really any trouble at all getting the DPS requirement to push him into Phase 2 before any of the conduits would have reached 100 energy, but we were not able to do enough DPS to keep a conduit from reaching 100 energy in Phase 2, going to 3. So if your DPS is similar, you will also have to choose one of the conduits to allow it to level up. By letting it get to 100 energy, it'll gain a level, and then you can let the energy go up once again to a high amount before you move away. So as mentioned, you can choose which conduit ability you don't want to deal with during the second phase and during the second intermission by allowing that one to be the highest energy at the end of Phase 1. So in our case, we chose to destroy the south conduit during the first time around because overcharge is the most annoying for the second intermission phase, in our opinion. Basically, it forces you to be potentially stunned, and a stun will prevent heals or from getting into the bouncing bolts and all that good stuff. So that was the one that we found to be the best option. So that said, we have the 3 others remaining, and the one we chose to actually allow to level up was the east conduit, and this is diffusion chain. So when we start Phase 2, we would move to the east first, which is the blue marker on the raid there, and kill the boss at that point. We keep him there till he levels up, so the conduit gets 100 energy, gains a level, and then another 90 plus after that. So we have enough DPS in our particular raid to only need one level up to occur during the second phase. And you want that to be whichever conduit is active that you feel will be the least dangerous to have an extra level during the upcoming intermission phase. So by far that was the diffusion chain for us. We basically, if you are spread out properly during the intermission phase, when diffusion chain is cast from a leveled up form, it will spawn 2 chains, or basically 2 adds if you're spread out. So it's only another 1.5 million damage that has to be dealt. It's not a lot of issue. In addition to that, you can actually make it a little easier on yourself by allowing one of your tanks to pick up the adds during that phase, because there are only 3 quadrants to cover. So you'll see that in a little bit here. But essentially we chose, as I said, the east or diffusion chain or quadrant to allow it to level up. And then once it gets close to max energy, then we move counterclockwise, in our case, to the next ones, just like we did in phase 1. And by the time we get to the last part, the boss is pushed to 35% or 30% rather, and the next intermission begins. All right, so once you get to 30%, then intermission 2 begins. And once again, you only have 3 quadrants active, so you have to split your raid up appropriately. So in our case, once again, we kept the healers opposite each other. And so this time I went with the melee team in the blue marker here. And then we have 1 tank, 2 DPS to the right in the red section. And then opposite is again the 1 healer and 2 DPS in the purple section. This leaves one of our tanks free to run around and pick up adds. And this was basically his idea, which worked out pretty well. And he was able to pick up any of the small adds that spawned because we had extra diffusion chaining, but also any big adds in case we messed up the bouncing bolt. So the footage you see here is actually the first time that we tried this method, and even though we make some mistakes, it works out well. So we're able to keep it under control by keeping the adds fairly well controlled until we can stabilize in the final phase. So otherwise, Intermission 2 is just like Intermission 1, except you've eliminated one of the abilities. So without any fear of stun on anybody, you can easily just run around a lot. So here you can see there's 2 bolts there, and I'm coming over to cover another bolt in another quadrant because someone died over here, and then soaking my own static shock. So yeah, it seems chaotic, but it's just a lot easier when you only have to cover 3 sections rather than 4. And once you get the second intermission down, then you'll be in the final phase against Lei Shen without any conduit abilities finally. Yay! So after Intermission 2, phase 3 begins, and if you have any adds, obviously you want to clean those up first and foremost. But believe it or not, this is probably the easiest phase. This is kind of a trend we're seeing where the final phase is not as tricky as the earlier parts. But that's okay. If you have everyone alive when you get to here, you're probably going to be fine. As long as you have enough DPS to beat the Berserk, basically. So he basically combines all of his unique abilities that are not conduit related in this final phase, in addition to a couple extra things. So there you can see Lightning Whip going on. He also uses Ball Lightning, so make sure you are spread out if Ball Lightning is coming up, and then you stack up to AE the adds down quickly. He also uses Thunderstruck, so you're going to have to watch for that. There it is there, and just run far away. And what else does he use? Oh, so his tank ability is different this time. It's Overwhelming Power, and this is a stacking debuff that just basically adds nature damage over an 8-second period when he does melee attacks. So your tanks just need to swap for that debuff, pretty basic. And then lastly is Violent Gale Winds, which you can see occurring right there. This will push your raid in a random direction. So it doesn't always have to be toward the center of the platform. And you've seen this wind sort of stuff before. In this case, it does 10,000 damage a second to everyone. And then it also applies a 5% damage increase to violent gale winds for every stack. And this just goes up infinitely. So that's your soft and rage mechanic. You have to have enough damage and healing to survive this phase, long enough to get him down there. So it's not that bad, really, like I said. So the only thing I can really offer as tips is to just keep a close eye on the timers for things and spread and stack as appropriate. The only time you have to be spread for anything is when ball lightnings are spawning. And it's not necessarily going to kill you if you're not, but you don't want to take that damage shortly following a Thunderstruck AE, basically, because that's the only thing you can't avoid. But otherwise, if you are stacked up, it's completely fine. You can easily avoid Thunderstruck by moving, whichever direction is the easiest to travel, especially if it's with the wind. And you can avoid the whip, and just stack up for ball lightning. So I think that covers everything for this fight. Now, normally I would say, good luck, thanks for watching, and I will do so, but I think it's also useful to go through this fight one time through and just walk through what we're doing. So if you've got everything you need, feel free to turn it off now, but otherwise I'm going to walk through the fight as a whole real quick and kind of just explain what we're doing as the phase transitions, because there are a few tips you can pick up there as well. So otherwise, good luck, and thanks for watching. All right, so we're starting on the south. As I mentioned, this is the platform we want to destroy so we don't have to deal with it during the second intermission phase. And we also stack up our healers, our ranged and our healers, kind of toward the center of the room so that that first overcharge that's likely on one of those players is far enough away to not hit anybody else, and we don't have to move at the start. Just a little more DPS time. And then Thunderstruck, pretty normal. So you'll notice during the first phases, there's not very much to heal. So I'm basically just doing DPS, / eminence healing. And so second platform here, where we got Diffusion Chain. Just a couple spawns. You can let your ranged DPS deal with those. And, oh, I forgot to mention, I apologize. It's too late now, but the power bar in the center of my screen, I was having major trouble with my add-on getting that to move properly. So I know it's really annoying. It's driving me crazy. So apologies for that. And our tanks found that they would sort of tank the boss to one side near a quadrant. So, pull him into whichever side he approaches on. Like right there, he's sort of on the right relative to me. And then when he does the lightning stuff, they can move him to the opposite side. So there's all the lightning stuff. And if they need to, they can move him out of that. So melee have a way to get at him, basically. Now, you'll notice for Static Shock, we stacked up just outside of melee range. We found that if you're right in melee range, one of your players could potentially be targeted by the lightning beams that he casts during that phase, by the Crashing Thunder, it's called. And that, plus the Static Shock going off, can be dangerous. So we found a little bit better just to stack just outside of melee range for Static Shock in both this phase and the next one. Or the second phase, rather, not the intermission. So there we soak up the bouncing balls. And that's one thing that is based on your DPS, but it worked for us. Rather than wait till we get 80 plus energy before transitioning from the third to the fourth conduit in the first phase, we would just go at 50 energy on the third conduit. Shortly after, a Thunderstruck would hit, but then we would be at the fourth conduit and able to get the first conduit ability, which is the bouncing bolts in our case. And we get that just in time for the phase transition. Because if we waited for 80 energy on the third one, our DPS was such that we would actually transition just as that conduit ability on the fourth conduit was hitting, and this would be a major issue. We wouldn't be able to get in position in time. So, again, that's just based on our particular DPS. It'll obviously be different for your raid, but just watch for that. If you have to stop DPS on the boss or you have to transition them early from one conduit to the next to do proper timing, then make sure you do that. At the end of that intermission, you'll notice that the timing is such as soon as we move him to our first conduit, which happens to be the east one here, we stay spread just until the summoned lightning balls are about to occur. As soon as those are about to pop up, we all stack up in melee range, and this will just force them all to clump up and we can AE them very quickly. And the timing is such that this will also occur as we transition to the next platform, pretty much. So right here, we're spread for the lesser diffused lightning spawn. We allow the conduit to level, and then as soon as ball lightning is about to be cast, we all stack up once again. And it works really well. This is probably the most damage-intensive aspect other than the static shocks when you're spread out for intermission. So your healers should just not be afraid to use their mana, basically, because you won't use it elsewhere in this fight. There's a lot of pretty low healing per second downtime here. So now that this conduit is leveled once, we're just going to wait for it to get high, and then we'll move out once more, going counterclockwise. So there was diffusion chain one final time, but again, it doesn't really matter. It's only a little bit of extra adds. And then as we're transitioning, we get the ball lightning, and that's the timing we want. Now we get the conduit ability, which is static shock, but it's perfect because we can just all stack up in melee range to soak the static shock while we're killing the ball lightning. And there's a lightning whip. And our tank getting knocked back. So as mentioned, our one tank gets knocked away. In that moment, the other tank taunts, so the boss doesn't move out of the conduit range very much. And then we soak up the balls first, and then stack up immediately for ball lightning that follows. And the nice thing is because the transition time is based on the conduit energy and not to do with your DPS or anything, these timings should match up for your own raid as well if you find that they're easy to copy, basically. So now we transition to the second intermission, and we're splitting our raid up 3, 3, and 3. As I mentioned, this allows our monk tank to run around to grab adds. And so here I'm with our melee DPS. And it looks like our hunter was by himself for static shock there. I don't know what happened exactly, but we're able to recover somewhat and then res him in the final phase. So there I can see there's 2 balls in our quadrant, so I'm going to cover this one that's in the other quadrant. And then solo soak the static shock. And there's the phase in, another ball there. So yeah, as mentioned, this was quite hectic, but I think this was the second time we've even seen the final phase, so it's not too difficult. Just keep people alive, and then you'll get through it. So you'll notice that, like so many of the wind abilities, you can cast while you're being pushed around. So you don't have to fight against it all the time. So we were staying spread until ball lightning hit, and now we're stacking up to take care of those. And there's the whip. And it's nice to just be in melee range when whip hits, then you have hardly any movement to get out of it. and Thunderstruck. One thing is just, it seems useful to try to move side to side if necessary rather than against the wind when Thunderstruck hits. And I didn't talk about it strategically, but it's a good idea also to make sure that the two quadrants that you deactivate, so the two that are the highest energy at the end of phase 1 and phase 2, are near each other. You don't want them to be opposite because that would mean you're stuck in one quadrant in terms of space to use for this final phase. And obviously that's tight quarters to do this in. And there we go. So just finishing him off, really. I think it's a pretty fun fight, and like I said, it seems appropriate for the last boss of the tier, at least for normal. We'll see what Raiden is like, hopefully. Sometime from now, though. One more whip, and he goes down. There we go. Yeah, so that is Lei Shen. Once again, thank you for watching, and good luck.